Welcome to Chaos, Logos, Order, where we apply the ideas of Jordan Peterson in order to create lives of increasingly heroic meaning. With our hosts, Guy Sengstock of thecirclinginstitute.com and Mark Michael Lewis, that's me, from the game of heroicmeaning.com. We're going through Jordan Peterson's new book, Beyond Order, chapter by chapter. In this episode, we go through Chapter 2, Imagine Who You Could Be, and then aim single-mindedly at that. Let's get into the chapter, and perhaps we'll bring in that kind of our own personal question, because the question of the chapter is, who are you? Who could you be?
Yep.
How do you conceptualize that? What do you like? So, who are you? Who could you be? And, what is it that has me, want to capture my best self in a story so that I can be it? So I can keep telling myself the best version of the story so that I live in that story.
Yeah.
Let's say we started.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because that's what the chapter is about. Who are we? Who could we be?
Yeah. Yes.
Right, and I will start with that question that he says. Right, specifically, he says, "Who are you?" And more importantly, who could you be if you were everything that you could conceivably be?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And later on in the chapter, he answers it. And this kind of sets the tone for where we are, where we're going. Answer, he writes. Who are you? You are part of the eternal force that constantly confronts the terrible unknown voluntarily. You're part of the eternal force that transcends naivete and becomes dangerous enough in a controlled manner to understand evil and beard it in its lair. Right? Part of the eternal force that faces chaos and turns it into productive order, or that takes order that's become too restrictive and reduces it to chaos, to render it productive once again. Right? Who could you be if you were fully truthful, whatever. So anyway, I thought I would start off with that quote.
Yeah.
To
Totally.
set the tone for this chapter of,
Yes.
Imagine who you could be and aim single-mindedly at that.
Right. Yeah, it struck me with this chapter was this one was so rich. This is so rich because this is basically talking about what we're doing, whether or not we understand it or not, at every single second almost, right? That's the thing was interesting to me about this is as I was reading it, I kept having this sense of, on one level, deliberateness, and another level, what we always find ourselves in. And that relationship about, I think you said one time, it's like you said, we can have as many different perspectives, right, on anything at any point, right? And the infinite amount of those perspectives, right, that we could have. But then you said, I think the problem is that we have perspectives and stories, right, that are not necessarily connected to each other and that don't go very deep. And then the sense in which, and you have so many choices about what stories that you have, but that the one choice that you don't have is that you have one, right?
That you have stories.
And I thought, yes, absolutely. And so there's this sense of this way in which, in some sense, to be a human being is to find yourself always when he talked about information, to find yourself always pulled in facing a potential, right? That's how we make sense of the world, right? And so the sense in which, what was the explicit rule? Imagine who you could be, then aim single-mindedly at that, right? And I think what he's talking about is that on some level we're talking about something that we can do deliberately, and at another level we're also talking about the very way our reality structures itself that we find ourselves inside of.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that I was like, as I was listening to that, I was in that sense of course, I would say that unless you do that deliberately, right?
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, you won't do it very well at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yes.
So to expand on it, you said we do it deliberately, and then there's like the thing that we're confronted with. Can you expand on that? Like what you mean
Well,
by that?
like this, it's like yes, I can tell like a good example of this. I was working. This is years ago. I was working with a client who came in, and he flew in from out of town, and it was the first meeting that which then would be like meeting every month for between 2 days and like 7 days at a time, just him and I.
Mm-hmm.
And he came in and he was very successful, had run a bunch of businesses and sold them and stuff. But he got himself into a point in his life where he couldn't leave the house because had so many phobias.
Mm-hmm.
And so he got himself out of the house. He flew and we met. And he's talking. We start talking. I was like, so tell me what's going on. And I would say within the first 45 minutes, right, he would start, let's say, a sentence. And every 2 to 3 sentences, he would end it with, yeah, but that's cool. It's all right. It's okay. He would reassure me. And then he'd start another sentence. At the end of it, he'd say, oh, that's all right. It's okay. It's cool. It's really cool though, right? And I started to count, right? When we got up to something like 30 times, I stopped and I said, so who are you talking to? He's like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, I've counted 30 times in which you've reassured me that it's okay, it's all right, and not to worry 30 times. And I said, I never implied that it wasn't okay and it wasn't all right. So who are you talking to? And he pauses, and there's that look. And I know you know that look, right? There's that look. It's like, who am I talking to? Right? And there's that opening. And I would say in that moment, what ended up being was there was an opening, and the opening was this, is that on some level, right, he was living in a story, right? And he saw me in terms of that story, and he saw himself in terms of that story. And therefore, part of that story was reassuring this other person that it's all right, it's okay, right? So when he stopped and he realized it, because obviously he had just met me, so it made it more tangible, right? To him go like, well, who am I talking to? And that began, right, him, you could say, going from seeing with his story, seeing with the narrative, right, to seeing it.
Yeah.
Right.
Seeing with or seeing through the narrative, seeing through the lens of the
Yes.
narrative, or seeing
Yep.
the narrative.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so what ended up happening is just in a certain sense. And a few minutes later, I was like, well, tell me a little bit about where you're from, like your family and stuff. And he says, oh, no, there's nothing there. They're great. There's nothing there. I don't think there's any, I mean, I'll talk about it with you, but I don't, they're just great people. And and then what we ended up finding out actually is when we looked, what we found was just, we found out, right, who he was talking to, right? We found out, like, and it made so much sense. And there was his, for example, his mother had, like, ended up having all these psychological illnesses. He constantly was in the state where everything would fall apart, and then he had to hold it, and he had to console his dad, and he's just holding up.
Where it's like, okay, things are falling apart, but it's cool. I've got it. Like, it's cool. It's okay. It's okay. I've got it.
Yes. So for him, he was always faced with this potential danger of things falling apart, in which everyone was looking to him to know what was happening and to save the day, but there was nothing under him. So he's constantly in this impossible situation, right? And heroically trying to overcome it. But of course, because he's saving everyone without letting them know that, or anyone asking him to, right? He got into these relationships that where he felt deeply betrayed and unseen and ungotten, and he had all kinds of conflicts going on in his life that he just couldn't leave the house for, right? And so seeing all of that, right, he started to be able to, like, one, notice the story and find out what he really, really wanted, basically, right? Yes. And heal a lot of those relationships, have those different conversations, and turn that, and actually confront the dragon, if you will.
A sec, because I have a quote that I think, actually two quotes from the chapter that I think really speak to this. Yeah. Okay, here's one. Jordan writes, everyone requires a story to structure their perceptions and actions in what would otherwise be the overwhelming chaos of being. Right?
Yeah.
That, like, the world is happening. He talks about envelopes, how, like, you get an envelope and you open the envelope and it could take you anywhere. It could be you won the lottery or you got the job, or you're being blackmailed, or someone, the love of your life, has been murdered. This is the unknown, the infinite unknown that Jordan continually says, this is what you're dealing with. And then we create stories, right? As he says, to structure their perceptions and actions in what would otherwise be the overwhelming chaos of being. So we create the story so that we can interact with the story, because we understand the story, and the story, we're comfortable, we're familiar with that story.
Yeah.
And then the story becomes just the automatic water that we're swimming in, and we no longer recognize that we're telling a story in order to interpret the world. It's just the way the world is.
Yep.
And then, in this case, in the story that he was telling, in the story that we're telling, he has a character. He's an agent.
In an arena.
Right, in an arena in which things are potentially not okay, and people are potentially freaking out. And he is saving them, right? And he's going to make it, and he's on an adventure that he's going to save the people, and he's going to make sure everything's okay. And that's the story. And in that story, when he talks with you, he projects the character from the story onto you, and now he's reassuring you as if you need reassurance. Right? There's that story. So
shows how primordial that we live in them.
Yes. Right? Yes. And
yes.
And you were saying earlier that one of the challenges is that we have a bunch of fractured stories.
Yeah.
Like in that case, he actually had a pretty integrated story. Everybody fell into that story.
Yeah. Right.
Wasn't
Right.
a story that led to his thriving.
Yeah.
Although it did lead to him becoming hyper competent, so that when he put his, it sounds like when he put
Yeah.
his attention on projects, he was successful enough. He was creating successful businesses and things. But like that story, he was locked in that story. But
Yeah.
Jordan in this chapter is saying, well, who are you? And who could you be? And who you think you are is a story that you're telling yourself.
Yep.
And who you think you could be is a story that you're telling yourself. And and in the chapter, one of the sections of the chapter is moving to monotheism. And he goes through the Marduk myth.
Yeah.
Where Marduk becomes the one god to which all of the other gods are subservient.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The dominant god in the hierarchy, the pinnacle value is the god, and so the god that can see the story that is, and can look past the story into chaos to improve the story ongoingly.
Yeah.
Right? To notice, like, and you were so great, and I laugh because we know this is what coaching is all about. It's that people have their stories. And it's not that the stories are bad. No. Most of the people we deal with are actually competent, perhaps even hyper competent.
Yeah.
It's just that they're locked in their stories.
Yeah.
They've got the order, but they need to go beyond order. And you and I, we help them see the narrative, the story they're telling as a story, so that they can see other stories. And this is the great god, the top god, Marduk, does this. And then all of the other gods are in service. Now, the god is the good. Like one of the books I hope to write at some point is Believing in Good, right? Because I believe in good. I don't necessarily believe in God. But so God is good. God is goal. The highest goal is God.
Yeah.
Like Jung would say, you're always worshiping God. Right? God is just your highest goal. The question is, what is the goal? What is the story that you're in that's the highest?
Yeah.
And if you've got a whole bunch of fractured goals, you've got this goal and this value, but it's inconsistent with this goal and this value, and inconsistent with this goal and this value, you need to create a meta god, a meta goal, a meta value, the highest value, such that all of the other values can be in service of it.
Yeah.
Right? The who could you be? What is the story of the highest value? So that you can have an ideal personality, so that you can have an ideal self, an ideal story into which all of your other stories fit. Like that, imagine who you could be, and then aim single-mindedly at that ultimate story.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. That.
That.
Do that right there.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, we were talking before we started. At my kind of insanity, not my insanity, my dedication. The particular way it shows up is that I often go to bed typing. So I type until I fall asleep. I've got this cool keyboard that allows me to type silently. So I type until I fall asleep. And it's like, why would you do that?
Yeah.
we were playing, and it's because it's like I'm attempting my spiritual practice. Like I'm attempting to answer this question that Jordan asks. Like, what who could I be? What's the best articulation of who I could be?
Yeah.
So that I can capture it in a story. So I try to write it down, like my best insights. I like to go to sleep, like thinking about what's the most beautiful, best thing I can do. Whatever everybody has their own practices, but like, how do we help our clients like set up a goal that is worthy, that's sufficiently inspiring that the pain and suffering of life that's part of the deal, like that's worthwhile because of that goal.
Yeah, totally. The thing, what would you say? Well, actually, what has to sit and write, right? On some level, what I heard you say is you're doing that so as to articulate your best thinking, your best ideas, the most beautiful. So what I like about this story is it just shows the madness of that. On some level, would you say that you could say that you're on one level, you're trying to articulate the peak, right? The highest story, right? But on another level, you got to say something already speaking to you, right?
Speaking to me, speaking through me.
Through you, and you already in some level have it in view, such that it's that combination that I notice is constantly the way that I'm working with clients and articulating. Because it's really interesting. It is articulating their goal, right? And it's some version of. It's usually some version of because one of the things I often notice is kind of what it is that, and this is the question, is like, this is a mystery to me, right? For me and to people I listen to, is like, as you listen to them deeply enough, we start asking this question, like, what is it that you're looking at? What is that you're seeing? What is it that's shining forth to you? And then we start to talk about that and articulate it. And then out of that, you could say that pattern, right, of looking at that, we realize both something innate, right, and over time, I would say the thing that starts to get articulate is what he's basically saying here, right, is who they could be, right, the best version of themselves, right? And there's a sense of, we're both listening to it and responding to it and creating it all at the same time. That's what I really liked about the way he put this, is this primordial way in which this is our nature to always be in this, right? And at the same time, it's something unknown is speaking to us that we're responding to, right? And we can both discover it. We both discover it and create it at the same time.
Beautifully put. So one of the things that he's famous for is being against ideologies. He has a chapter in this, like abandon ideologies. Yeah. Because what you're describing is it's the rule, it's the exhortation, it's the suggestion, it's like he's begging us. Look, no, determine who you could be.
Yeah.
And then aim single-mindedly at that. Like, please, for your own sake, for the sake of goodness, please do that. Because unfortunately, right? I mean, in a sense, it's great for us because it's like secure employment. Is that people don't do that naturally, regularly. Most people do not do that. And even people who do that don't do it as well or as deeply as they could they end up getting caught in, oh no, I'm going to tell the story and I'm going to try to protect the story rather than let me articulate a better version of the story.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's something there. He talks about Plato remembering, right? That there's something already there. There's a potential that's built into the phenomenological reality of the evolved human animal.
Yep.
There's something about that. It's already there.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to articulate it.
Yeah.
But in the process of articulating it, we're actually creating something that makes it more.
Yeah.
But it's more of what it already could be as this, and that.
Yeah.
That.
There's that phenomenological.
Yeah. There's
reality.
there's that dance, that becoming, but we don't necessarily do that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We're not necessarily in the role of the hero, Marduk.
Yes.
Right? Who is honoring the existing gods, who has mastered the skills of the existing gods, and therefore is above them and goes beyond into capturing Tiamat in a web and cutting her up into useful things. Right? To go into chaos and to make it useful.
Yeah.
Being that hero, being the hero on the border of on top of order, reaching into chaos, beyond order.
Yeah.
But an antidote to chaos because he's bringing order and the ability to articulate. Being that is a choice. The game of heroic meaning, the project that I'm on, it's all about naming that choice. Now that choice is available. You could say this entire chapter, maps of meaning in general, but this chapter 11, is really about, let's look to the stories that humans have created over the last 5,000-10,000 years. Which are the stories that stuck?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Which are the stories that when we hear them, we go, that points to that thing that I kind of know, which is good. This story actually addresses that thing I don't know how to talk about yet. This inarticulate thing that is already there because I'm human.
Yeah.
Because I'm faced with this phenomenological world as well as the objective world. Mm-hmm. That world has an optimal solution or a class of optimal solutions. And if we look at all of the stories and we look across all the stories that stuck, because you can tell a story, but if it doesn't catch on, it's because it didn't articulate that thing. But when you tell a story and it lasts for thousands of years, right? It only lasts for thousands of years because it speaks to that story. Brett Weinstein, makes a big point about this. It's that if you've got parts of stories that aren't useful, it takes too much effort to repeat them. So they disappear. It's the ones that are useful that. So if we look at the stories, we can study the existing stories to use them to help articulate whatever that thing is. But then we have to choose to be the hero. And that is a choice that we can make. It's a stance we can take. I call it a game. It's like you can play a game where the game is, how much can I be that hero? And the more I'm that hero, the more points I get in the game. And I don't want to be the villain who leverages order for power rather than for growth. And I don't want to be the hero who destroys order so that I can escape the limitations that it puts on me.
Right.
Right. I don't go into chaos to escape. I go into chaos to slay the dragon, to be the hero rather than the villain. That's the fundamental choice.
Right.
And this chapter is saying, do that.
Yeah. And I think what you're pointing to is another way you're saying it is it's on some level because we're human, we're always in relationship to that something, that domain of the unknown.
We
And it's
can't
interesting because
we can't
it's
not
both
be.
potential and chaos. It's like potential in a bright sense, and it's also what can destroy everything in another sense, right? So it's an inherently, it doesn't give itself over as just good, but there is a difference, and I think this is what you're talking about, right? There is a difference between when I volunteer to face it, right? It's that volunteer, like this is, I was going to ask you about, I think wasn't it Aristotle that talked about that all the virtues presuppose and kind of in some sense arise from courage, the virtue of courage. Like all virtues, right, require the virtue of courage, right? And I got that sense of like that this is so much about that way in which voluntarily turning towards what is most uncomfortable but most potentially good, right? Versus, right? Versus, in some sense, preserving, protecting, in an unconscious way, right? Versus like a stance in which because I was thinking also about this too. We do ourselves a disservice when we don't make the distinction between what I would call vulnerability, right, and exposure, right? Like I think most of the time when we think of being vulnerable, right? For example, I've never like in a course or anything like that. I don't think I've ever had the experience of when I've looked at somebody and said, "Hey, maybe a good idea just to be vulnerable right now." I've never had anybody go saying like, "I was hoping you would say that. I've been waiting to be vulnerable my whole." It's usually like this, and it's interesting because I think the association there is oftentimes are moments, like historical moments in which we involuntarily, right, got exposed to the elements, so to say, right? Our pants pulled down in the on recess. There's these moments where it flashes, right? That comes forth, right? And so there's a protection against that. So in some way, what I hear you saying and what I hear him saying, right, is when you dedicate to what you ultimately could be, articulate that, right, and move towards it. That's an act of courage and vulnerability, right? It is not an act of exposure. It's an act of like inviting and facing and opening, right?
Amen. So another like language game that speaks to that same idea is humility versus humiliation.
Yep. Right.
Right.
That's a great one.
To the degree that I recognize my own limitations,
right,
and own them, right? Not that there's something wrong with me. It's just I'm open, as Jordan Peterson says, to treat someone as if they know something I don't. Right? That I'm open to learning, that I'm open to, I have order.
Yeah.
But I allow for it to be incomplete. In fact, I assume that there's more. And so I own my own limitations without judging myself. Versus if someone else points out my limitations as a limitation that I should feel bad about.
Right.
Right. And that's humiliation versus humility. Jordan
Yeah.
Jordan talks again and again about how, just from a biological neurophysiological level, if you take on a task, you take on a goal, and then an obstacle comes up in the context of a goal that you have chosen voluntarily,
Yeah.
then your body, different neurological systems come into play in relation to that goal. Then if you don't choose the goal, if you
Yeah.
don't face the dragon, right,
Yeah.
then the dragon comes to your village
Yeah.
and surprises you. That same obstacle, the same dragon, if you go face the dragon, different neurology than if the dragon comes to you, and that voluntary choice turns what could be humiliation into humility.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Instead of being exposed as broken, you vulnerably open yourself to learning, to becoming beautiful.
And
Beautiful.
so when I think about Mark falling asleep, talk about volunteering, right? Letting it speak to you, you speaking it, articulating, all like you were eking out the last, all the way to your sleep, right?
Yeah, and it's fun because as you're saying this, I'm taking my experiential way of living and being, and now I'm seeing it as a story, and so like I'm getting some distance from it, and I notice, on the one hand, I do it because there's something calling me. Like I have some idea, which is like, that's a cool idea. I like how I'm formulating that. I like, ooh, that bit of language, that phrasing is fantastic. Like I've come to just love phrasing. I even came up with a phrase which says, oh shoot, I'll remember in a minute. So I find a phrase and I'm like, oh, I have to capture that. I want to capture that. And so the idea leads me to type.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then it's also just a practice, like a spiritual practice. Like I do it, whether I'm inspired or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I get on the path and allow the inspiration to come, and I prompt myself with questions like, well, so what did I learn today?
Yeah.
Like, how do I want my tomorrow to be?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll prompt myself, okay, around my wife, what can I do to make her life more beautiful? Okay, so I'll ask that question, and then I'll just think, and I'll like feel into and articulate, like allow the articulation to come. That, and I feel very much that is what Jordan Peterson is trying to, or that's what I resonate with him. Around.
Yeah, that when you would allow that you did this thing where you like just speak and allow that articulation to come through, right? That it reminds me of weaving, right? There's something about like in some sense the Greeks talk about fate being a weaver, right? And it's and the challenge, of course, is like to love your fate, right? So there's this kind of way in which it sounds like and to bring in the last chapter, right? Don't dedicate institutions. In some sense, you've created like, would you say it's a practice? On one level, I'm called to do it, right? But on another level, I've noticed enough times there are things like calls that when I articulate them and listen to them, right, to know enough that an institution called this practice should be set up, whether or not it's actually I'm inspired or not, right? So in some sense, wouldn't you say that just the practice of doing that? I'm loving this example, right? This is great. Just the practice of doing that is something like an institution that you've created for yourself that holds you based on, right, that speaks to this potential, even when it's not literally speaking to you on a level of inspiration and feeling. Is this an example of that? Say?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. You know, people, like, there's often a question asked, like, what makes human beings distinct from other animals? Right. And there's a lot of different answers to that question. And all of them are quite interesting. I think all of them are provocative. The one that I like the most, the one that speaks to me most, is that human beings can make commitments. Right? As far as we know, we're the only animal that can make a commitment, that can say, in the future, I'm going to be this character pursuing this goal in this arena. Right? I'm going to be this agent in this arena on this adventure in the future. And I'm going to design it in advance. I'm going to set up a practice or an institution. And if you set up this, and if you think about it that way, I like that framing, that it's an institution that you've set up as a practice, because the practice is valuable. That's why these stories, that's why Jordan Peterson says, like, here are the, like, when you look at the stories, here's the meta story, the institution that culture after culture after culture after culture has said, that's worth keeping. That's worth doing as a commitment, even when it's not inspired. Just do this. Listen to this story. We're going to set up story time, and around the campfire, we're going to tell this story. It doesn't matter if you're inspired to tell the story. It's story time, because that institution opens up the possibility of understanding the hero, of telling a story that inspires you, that's worth, and perhaps the meta story, the meta god, the ultimate story of who you could be, into which all of the other stories find their place as the meta god.
Yeah. Yes. So that's what you're doing.
that is what I'm doing.
Sunglasses.
Yeah.
Yes. And I like the thing. I also like what you said, and this is, it struck me when you said, and you ask yourself a question, right? Like, essentially, if good was, like, who could I be for my wife such that more and more good happened, right? And in some sense, the question, and it sounds like the quality of the question it's this unusual, it's this kind of in-between place, which is really fascinating, where it's like the question is actually opening up to, in some sense, the potential. You're like just asking the question seems to invite it opens up a domain, right, such that it can start to speak, right? It presupposes it and invites it.
Yeah, it says, be creative.
Yeah.
Discover within this particular domain.
Yeah.
Like, don't go anywhere.
Yeah. Yes.
Like, but go in that direction, not to this place particularly, other than, try to get to that place because there's more to discover there.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I like to say that you only need a map when you don't know how to get somewhere.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But
right. Mm-hmm.
But let's say I'm going to go visit San Francisco for the fun of it. Not because there's a task I need to do in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But because I'm going there to explore. Now, I know how to get to San Francisco. I know, like, I drive there like the back of my hand. It's like, and I kind of know a lot about, I've driven all over San Francisco. I know San Francisco. And I can think about it as, am I completing the map of San Francisco? I'm attempting to take all the creativity out of San Francisco. I'm trying to take all of the unknown and claim it as known so that I no longer have to deal with San Francisco. I no longer have to think about San Francisco because I already know it.
Yeah. Yes.
One way of doing it. And then there's this beginner's mind kind of way, which is the more I know about San Francisco, the more I don't know about San Francisco, and the more curious I get about San Francisco. And I can use my map to get myself into a place where from there I can discover what's there. And that's exactly what I'm doing. And that's exactly what the story does.
Yeah.
This myth, the religion, and this is why not having a religion is problematic. Yeah. Not having a religion is problematic because then you don't have a master story in which all of the other stories fit. You don't have, like, the good thing about a religion, whether or not it's accurate, the good thing about a religion is that it provides a story which is deep enough and has enough tradition that the stories told in the religion are the ones that have lasted for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Yeah.
They've already been tested phenomenologically to say this is worth retelling.
Yeah.
So it's got that. And then there's a whole bunch of them. It's a deep story. A religious story is deep enough such that all of your other stories can fit into it. Whereas if you don't have a story that is at least religious in scope and integrated like a religious story. If you don't have that, then you end up with all of these fractured stories. You don't have a monotheism. You've got these various gods which end up at war because they don't have a relationship to one another. And then you end up destroying the foundation. You destroy the institutions because the institutions don't have an integrated home.
Yeah.
And so this story of the religion says, be creative, be heroic, be the best self you can be in this arena. Like, I don't ask, what do I hate most about my wife and my life with my wife?
Right. What's wrong with her? All right, like, go 10 minutes.
Now, I could do that, and unfortunately, many people, that's the game they play.
Yeah.
It's like they go talk with their friends, and they say, let me tell you all of the things that suck about my relationship. And I'm going to tell that story, and I'm going to get really creative and articulate and create meaningful stories that head towards hell rather than heaven.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I in my Thriving Partnerships course, I call them love stories versus leave stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And I'm choosing consciously, intentionally, with as much intensity as I can manage. Knowing that the more I do it, the more intensity I can manage next time, and the more beautiful, like the more I map out this question, very, very important question, like in my life, because, you know, having chosen to be married when I never intended to get married, having chosen to be married, I'm choosing to be married.
Yeah.
I'm choosing that my life is no longer just my life. It is our life. And her life is no longer her life. It is our life. Her happiness is now my happiness. Her satisfaction is now I'm choosing that. That's the game. That's the thing of our vows, right? So, so I am, the more I think the question, what can I do to make her life more beautiful, satisfying, fulfilling, to make our relationship more ecstatic, functional,
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
The more I write that, the more I think that, the more I articulate that, then tomorrow I wake up and I've got a better story.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then I do it again.
Yeah.
And I've got a better story. And my foundation keeps getting better and better and better and better. So I start from an optimal story. Now, how much better can I make it? Infinite. There's no limit to how good I can get. There's no limit to how much I can love her. There's no limit to how sweet it can be with her. But I'm aiming for sweet. That's the institution. And that's what the religion does. That's what the story does. And if Jordan's creating this meta story, like beyond all religion, you don't need to believe any particular religion, but get the story. Here is the meta story of being the hero. And here's what a hero consists of, whether it's Marduk or Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. Like, here's what a hero consists of. Do that. What's your version of that? Here's the world. What's your version?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So that's what you're doing.
Another quote.
Mm-hmm.
He says, each story has a goal, a good. Oh no, actually this is my note. Each story has a goal, a good, a God that gives it meaning. He says, integrating all the gods under a single God provides a context to integrating your value, yourself, your ideal personality. No, again, that's mine. Okay, so I'm going to do the quote from memory because I pulled out the wrong quote. He says, here's the question. You've got these two elements. One, what's the highest value? So that you can be subservient to that. So that you can align with it. So that you can use it to pattern who you are. What's the highest value?
Right.
But on the other hand, what's your sovereignty? Like, who are you in and of yourself? Not in, like, who are you? And there's this dance between the sovereignty and the good. And again, I understand it, to use the language we've just talked about. It's like there's a set of constraints. There's a set of limitations, a guidance, a question that frames the domain in which I'm now going to be creative and bring myself to discover. And it's that, again, that relationship between order and chaos.
Yeah.
Between being able to follow the rules and then to break the rules in service of the spirit of the rules.
Right.
Right. That's,
it's like in what you're saying. I just want to get this distinction you made about religion, which I thought was great, of that. And what's cool about religion is historically they, in some sense, abstracted out, right, the meta question that pointed you towards the right chaos, right? Because there's all kinds of chaoses that you can open up, but which is the one that is where the real virtue and potential is, right?
yes.
And so that there's a way in which sovereignty isn't necessarily separate, right? It's necessarily deeply wise, right? So to the degree that I can volunteer to the right chaos, right? The most ideal thing that's going to make the biggest difference to not only me, but me in the future, right? And as far in the future as possible to the other people in my life, right? To society as at large, as to my life, right? Those things that in some sense, if it's the right chaos, right, it allows us to become someone who could be the kind of being that could ask questions that invite the right chaos, right? That this,
yes, and the more we ask the right questions, the more we invite the right chaos, which improves our questions, which leads us to the right chaos. And religions have already done that. They're asking the important questions, the most important questions.
Yeah.
Totally. And that Ken Wilber said about psychedelics. Mm-hmm. Right? He said, "Here's how we handled psychedelics in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. We said, oh, there's this molecule that that when we ingest the molecule,
right,
it affects the mind in such a way that people have mind-boggling experiences, many of which are considered to be religious in scope and nature.
Yep.
That get people to ask fundamental questions about the self and consciousness and the world and values, that provoke those so intensely that it's an altered state experience that is often life-changing. Yeah, let's make that illegal. That molecule that causes that experience, let's say we can't even research that. No way. No thank you. Right? And I think Ken Wilber, I think Jordan Peterson is saying something similar about religion. Like the modern sensibility is it accurate?
Yeah.
Is the storytelling, did that actually happen in objective reality? And the answer is, let's not look at that because we don't think so. And that, okay. But that's not the question. The question is, we've got these religions and it's not cool to believe in them because accuracy and science and it's not cool. Therefore, let's ignore all of the moral, spiritual questions of consciousness and phenomenological. Let's just ignore all of that. Nope. All of those stories that these are the stories that have been chosen after thousands of years. Like people tell stories. Millions of people tell stories over time. And this is the set of stories that have lasted for thousands of years and are designed to get us to think about the most important questions in life. Nope, don't think about that. Religion, nope, whole thing, just nope, don't do it. and he's like, no, let's look at them. Let's go beyond the accuracy thing. Like not objective reality like science in the sense of empirical data, but phenomenological reality. Like what's it like? Yeah. How do you experience human in terms of values? These religions provide the context that provokes you to discover who you are and who you could be, such that you can aim for that. Religion says this is the most important. The first commandment, in terms of the 10 Commandments, is there shouldn't have any other gods behind other than the highest possible God. You shouldn't be. You shouldn't privilege any version of yourself above the best possible self that you could possibly be.
Yeah.
That's the first commandment. And then Jesus, he taught, the one commandment is to love the Lord, thy God, the goal, the good, to love that which is good, the highest version of what is good. To love that, to ask the questions and to explore that chaos, to articulate what is it that you've got that makes it more beautiful so that you can ask a better question so that to love it. That's what love is.
Yeah.
Right? To love is to look for what is beautiful and to attempt to capture
come to terms with it.
To come to terms, yes, absolutely. To come to terms with it, and to integrate it
So
into.
the terms you stand on that allow you to go even deeper into what you are to come to terms in. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and like, how tragic would it be to have the best minds and the best hearts and the best souls from multiple traditions around the world who are attempting to ask and answer the deepest possible questions, not theoretically, not philosophically, but phenomenologically. Like, how can we tell a story to the next generation such that the next generation asks questions that lead to a life that actually works? A Piagetian game where
Yeah.
you're a hero who not only makes your life better,
Yeah.
right, such that you create a better arena for your story, and a better agent and a better adventure, not just for you, but for the people that you play with, for you, the people you love and care about, and for the world, and not just now in this moment, but for the future self, in the short term and in the long term. That Piagetian game, perhaps that
Right.
ultimate Piagetian game.
Right.
How sad would it be to discount the thousands of years from across cultures of people attempting to answer that question and provide institutions, to provide a set of questions and lenses through which you can become your best self? How tragic.
Right.
And even though, like, I'm an atheist for all practical purposes,
Mm-hmm.
right? I like to say, hey Christian, or hey Muslim, or hey whatever, you know, all those gods that you don't believe in, I don't believe in them either. Like, we have that in common. Of all the gods that you don't believe in, I don't believe in them either. I also just don't believe in yours. But the stories of your religion, I'm really interested in, to see how they guide me.
Mm-hmm.
How tragic not to use that particular resource when that resource is the most fundamental resource.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And wouldn't you say that one of the things that Peterson is revealing is that it's, in some sense, it's almost it's virtual. Things turn into a religion, whether or not you like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
That there is a which we are the creatures, we are the logos beings, we're the ones that
Mm-hmm.
speak and listen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and that in doing that, that we are constantly, in order to perceive anything, right, it has to be valuable enough such that we can even look at it, right? And that what gives that value, or we're standing on top of narratives and stories and history, right, which is in some sense our nature. And that, I think the thing I would say is it seems to me is that we're religious anyways. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's not an option in some sense to not be religious in the deepest sense of the word,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, and I like this because I like the way that he talks about it in terms of chaos and order, and the optimal infinite sweet spot of like that place, right? It's like the way I like to conceptualize is like as if it's an island, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at the center of the island is the most stable. It's the oldest, right? And it's the
Mm-hmm.
most stable, the
Mm-hmm.
most structured, the most ordered. And then as you get move out towards the edge, it becomes it's newer, it's less stable, it's less ordered, but it's still ordered. And then when you get all the way up to the edge of the island, that's where all like the artists are, right? And the crazy philosophers and the mystics. In a certain sense, there are always those people that have a particular proclivity for the unknown as such, right?
Mm-hmm.
To in some sense is to listen to what is yet in language but is showing itself, right? And then to bring it, in some sense, to bring it, the first articulations of it, into society, into the culture. And if the middle is working well,
Mm-hmm.
right, this new information will be disruptive. But
Mm-hmm.
if the structure is in relationship to novelty coming in, right,
Mm-hmm.
that novelty can update, you could say, the structures, right, such that by the time it hits the center, it's not rejected, right, and divided against it, but in some sense the most the deepest archy, the deepest purified, articulated, powerful part of that information is transformed into logos, right? In a sense, it updates the father at the center, if you will, right? And I think that it's like, that's also an image of a person, right? I think that's the thing that I hear. That's the thing I hear. Peterson is often talking about in terms of what an individual is. Well, on some level, an individual is precisely that thing, that there are aspects in us where we want to volunteer to open up to chaos,
Mm-hmm.
right? In such a way that it updates and deepens, right, our ability to open up to chaos, right, in a way that allows us to become someone who can voluntarily face it, and it can be more beautiful, more love, all of those kinds of things. So it's like, in some sense, the monotheism is as much talking about the individual, right? That we're at a point where, in some level, we're saying that the cosmos, each person is a kind of cosmos in and
Mm-hmm.
of themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, beautiful. Let's expand on that metaphor, on that visualization, because I love it. I love it. Brilliant. I'm going to steal that and absolutely use it, because
Mm-hmm.
the way that you described it is that the center of the island is the most stable.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's the dominant story in modern terminology, in postmodern terminology. We could say that that is the privileged story. Right? It's the story that the most of us take, such that as you move out towards the edge, right? If you think about it just in terms of binary, well, there's order and chaos. But no. Let's look at this island. The center of the island is the most order. The best questions that we can use, if we're being heroic, we can use that order to extend into chaos optimally. Because this is the center of the island, is the part that we've decided is most valuable as a culture. First, we'll deal with culture, then we'll deal with the individual. And then on the edge, you end up in the ocean, where nothing is stable.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then there's this shoreline where the tide comes in, and it's partially stable, but partially fluid, and it's constantly changing. Mm-hmm. There are patterns to the change, but it's constantly changing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And like tide pools. Neil Purton Rush has this beautiful song called Natural Science, which uses tide pools as a metaphor for this. It's really exploring exactly what we're talking about through the metaphor of tide pools. It's just amazing song. But then there's the beach.
Yeah.
And the beach, where the water doesn't actually come up, that's more stable. than the shore, which is more stable than the ocean, but the beach is less stable than the center. But then there's the next level, and then so there's a gradient from the most stable to the most chaotic. So it's not order and chaos as a binary. It's order and chaos as a spectrum.
Yep.
And the artists, Jordan Peterson uses the example of Impressionists and even the Cubists, where when the Impressionists started, they were way out on the frothy edge of the shoreline. And they said, check this out. We're gonna paint light. We're gonna paint how it appears to the eyes rather than attempting to capture the actual facts. We're gonna shift from the subject of our painting being stuff to the subject of our painting being stuff as we perceive it. Like that revolution in art, that when it happened, people threw riots. How dare you upset the center? That goes against like the traditions that we've been building, the institutions that we've been building. Now you could say the center said no, but that's okay, because the center isn't the only one who speaks. There's all of these layers. And then it comes in, and the question is, which of those actually make it all the way to the center? Which of those make it through all of the filters to make it to the center? And you can say that two ways. One is the things that make it to the center are the pure. They're the essentials. They're the best of the best. But it's also true that it's the lowest common denominator. Right? Because the center is, what can we teach to everybody? What's a game that everybody can play, essentially? Like everyone can learn the religion. So we have to have simple stories. Because we're talking to everybody. Ken Wilber again talks about the exoteric parts of religion and the esoteric part of religion. The exoteric are the standard stories, but the esoteric is once you've taken on those stories and you looked at them, and then you go into chaos and you refine, and you go into chaos and you refine, and you go into chaos. What are the advanced versions of those stories? And the more advanced, the more deep they get, the more profound they get, the more esoteric it gets. It's still part of the center, but not really. And so there's this, like, when it gets lowest common denominator, it becomes tyrannical. No, you can't paint light. You have to paint the subject. Tyranny. So this island metaphor, like I've expanded it to, now let's bring that to the individual. Right? Well, you've got like a core understanding of yourself, who you think you are, who you think you should be. And then you've got all these other parts. The psychoanalytic tradition says, and Jordan Peterson points out again and again, every goal has its own personality. So we're a collection of personalities. Some of them are very solid and they're integrated. But as you go out towards the edge, some of our goals, some of our values, some of our stories are not integrated into the center. And that's good, because we're evolving, we're growing, we're heroically growing. Okay, so now, last part for this. Now, what happens if you destroy the center? Well, like all of the different stories, all of the different stories no longer have a system into which they integrate. And now they end up at war with one another, claiming territory so that they can create their own center. And when you end up with all kinds of different centers at war with one another, rather than cooperating and competing, and this is the difference between a market. In a market, you cooperate and compete, versus in a controlled system, you do what the top tells you to do. Tyranny. That if you individually don't have a center, then your various personalities will end up at war with one another rather than cooperating and competing. And that's why you choose the highest possible good.
Mm-hmm.
You imagine the ideal person that you could be. And then you aim at that single-mindedly. You're trying to create a center which is good enough and complex enough that it can set the context for the rest of the island. And if you do that, like, and that's specifically what the game of heroic meaning is about. It's like, how do you tell the central story into which that center of the island so that you can be on the frothy edge? Be creative and allow what actually fits. Let's find out. We're not going to decide in advance. We're going to have the conversation.
There you go. That's the essence of, like, that's where I think the key is, right? I think it's what we're inside of right now, right? Is the dialectic, right? Is this sense of opening to the other point of view, right? The other story. This is really the important part, because I just, as we were talking about this, because I haven't really thought about this analogy or metaphor in a while, but I had this sense of, like, well, there's also the case where the poet, the philosopher, the artist can also come to the very center and then listen to it, like the ocean, right? Like, in some sense, I think this is the role that Peterson's playing in the book. Right?
I can't, his whole work. Yes, absolutely. Continue. But yes.
In some sense, he's saying, no, this center, right? There's something here if you can listen to it, right? If you can listen to it, right? Yeah, so I would imagine in some level for him, looking at it like this, it's like, for him, as the author, the figure in his work, in some sense, he's he's radical, right? In where he's going to be, in some sense, the artist, right?
Yeah. Beautifully put. You know, it's fun. Some people are saying it's interesting how conservatism is becoming the new rebellion. Right? Because you could say the liberal perspective has taken on cultural dominance.
Yeah.
You rebel by being conservative. And in this sense, I think this is, Jordan Peterson gets a ton of heat from the liberal left. Now, he also gets a lot of heat from the right as well, but the liberal left has a much louder voice in media, and so you hear it more. He represents a reclaiming of the center because he's bringing his artistry as an artist. Right? He's going back to the classics, but he's making them new.
Yep.
He's not repeating the classics. He's creating a whole new kind of art, a whole new type of philosophy. Not that he created it from whole cloth, right? He's stitching together various other people, but he does it with artistry and creation. It's like, you can't deny that Jordan Peterson is Jordan Peterson. Like, he's not Jung. He's not William James. He's not Heidegger. He's not, like, he's his own thing. But what he's doing is he's going back to the center versus the artist is normally out on the frothy edge. But he's bringing that artist sensibility to the most basic fundamental questions. Again, brilliant guy. Love it. That opens up so many interesting thoughts.
in some sense, I think about like with with as a coach, I often feel that way. In some sense, like if I look at like, well, what was I already? What do I already understand, such that it made sense to say, who are you talking to, right? In some sense, there's an attunement to that. Actually, this is the thing. It's so hard to put this into words, but I I'll keep trying because it keeps glowing. It's so gorgeous, right? Is this way where people, even in their most insane, self-destructive, um, hysterical, that at somewhere in the bottom there's something that glows, right? That, and I think it's something like care, right? Is that's one of the amazing things about a human being is they really are a cosmos. And if you listen, although like like the way that they're telling the stories on one level is not working for them, right? Or anybody else. However, the fact that they're telling that they have one, right, is seems to be presupposing something very, very deep, right? And as you go deeper and deeper into it, you start to reveal this. Well, I have the experience of continually just falling in love with people,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
As for levels of this, is there's something that glows, and of course in in being, you could say, the phenomenologists that we are in our work, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can kind of go on that level and go that and hear it, and both of us hear it, that there is something essentially good that's aimed in that direction, although it's can be misled, it could be mistaken, it could be all these kinds of things, but that,
The expression of love
right,
might be slightly distorted
yeah,
by the
absolutely,
nature of the story. Yes.
totally. And that even that is trying to handle a concern that as you go deep enough, right, it's really quite beautiful in my experience of it, right? So a lot of that, here's that kind of that interesting spot that we're talking about. And on one level, we're talking about it like where it's like we find ourselves called, right? We have a call. It speaks to us. We find ourselves like already listening. And at another level, there's a way in which we are choosing it, right? These two things working together. That's what I'm most present to in this conversation.
Amen. Again, the highest value
Mm-hmm.
and the sovereignty.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Like what shines forth for me,
Yep.
and in the process of articulating it, what's the the image, the coming to terms with the language, the story that has already shined forth, that constrains optimally to guide me towards what shines forth, so that I can
Yeah.
better concentrate on what shines forth.
Yeah. Yes. Totally.
Right. Absolutely. It's like when you said it struck me.
Yeah. What struck?
I continually fall in love with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And I, like, for me, I define that precisely, or I have a very specific meaning for that, which is like, if love is seeing someone as beautiful and wanting their thriving, wanting their fulfillment, wanting their happiness, their joy, their meaning, their depth, their courage, their aliveness, their self-discovery, becoming more of who they could be, aiming more and more towards the fulfillment of who they could be, their heroism. If I say that that's what love is, to love in this way, to love someone is to see that in them and want that for them, that down in all their craziness and their hysteria and their self-destructiveness, in their, even in their malevolence, that when you be with it,
yeah,
and you like, what's the story you're telling? When you look for the part of them that is the author, rather than just the story they're telling or the actor they're being, but the part of them that is the author, and you can get them to like examine the story, the author, that part is good. That part is good fundamentally. And if you follow that back, then if you ask that set of questions, when I'm working with a client, when I'm hanging out with you, when I'm with my wife, when I'm with my friends, if I look for that, then I see it. And I find it. And I speak it. And I breathe it. And I stance it. And I be, and I like, I see you. I trust that your author is good. I'm going to connect with that part of you.
Yep.
Then they show up that way. They shine forth in that way. And the more I do that, the more they actually shine forth in that. And then I get to see more of them and I fall in love with them. I discover more and more parts of them which are beautiful in such a way that it touches me, it grabs me so much and so quickly that it feels like I'm falling. It's like there's this experience of love and it's so like that I fall into it. And like, I love my clients.
Yeah.
I love them profoundly. Their beauty, whatever their particular story and hangups are, and whatever the goals, the valuable goals that they're actually creating, whatever that is, I love them. That fundament so again, this is personal, right? In my meditations, Jordan Peterson says in this chapter that it's not that we teach children to put personalities into things. Like we take the sun and we make it a personality, and we take the water and we make it a personality, and we take the tree and we make it a personality. It's not that we do that. It's that that's the natural occurring. That's the natural way of being, is that we project person onto the world. When we look at a car, we see a face. Right? The headlights and the grill, like we see a face in a car because that's the natural thing. It's actually an effort to not see the personality, to see the tree not as a being, a person, but as a thing. That's actually an abstraction that we have to add. So existence itself, the phenomenological shining forth. Let's say that was a person. Right? For lack of a better term, we could call that person God.
Yep.
Then you could have a personal relationship with the blossoming unfoldingness.
Yeah.
And you can love it or not. my spiritual practice is to love it versus not, because there's so much of me that doesn't love it, that finds it wrong and broken, that finds the self that I am wrong and broken. Right? And that got me into therapy as a suicidal teenager, and like I'm diagnosed with depression. That's like there for me. If I don't choose to love existence, I will hate it.
Yeah, it's really important what you just said.
Good thing is that the more I practice loving it, the easier it is, and the deeper the love becomes.
Yeah.
This is why, like when the Ten Commandments say, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," right? Thou shalt not love anything more than you love me. The existence itself, the creativity at the heart of existence, whatever it is about existence that allows me to love, that makes love part of the phenomenological isness of life, that makes that possibility, whatever that is, thou shalt not love, thou shalt not put anything above that. To love that, the Lord thy God, that God, with your entire heart and your entire soul.
Yep.
I'm not Christian, but that commandment, that one, like that's the dance. That's the dance I'm in.
Yeah.
I think that's why I love Jordan Peterson so much, is because he really encourages me in that dance.
That's what calls you to vulnerability.
I would like to think that I am willing to do anything in the service of that. That is the most important thing.
I also like think that there's something
that's what I want to aim at single-mindedly.
Yeah. And I think you said something really important, is that if I don't love it, I will hate it. Right? That's one of the things I think, if we were to ask, well, what's at that center ultimately? It's in some sense it's almost like there is one thing you don't have a choice about, is that, right? Is that because of the strange in-betweenness that is kind of our ontological state as human beings, right? Is that we don't get to be an object that just sits there and gets to be neutral. We are either heading up or we're heading down, right? We are either, it's in that sense, we don't get a break. We are constantly in relationship with our values, conscious or unconscious, right? And so that's one of the fundamental things. And if you can love that, right, I think that's probably what's so powerful, to me anyways, about as Peterson says, the Christian story, right, is essentially the best human being that the worst thing happens to, right? And that relationship, and that he went, right? Can we say it's good? That question is, in some sense, that's always in some sense, we're demonstrating that in every second, what our answer to that question is, right?
Yeah. So you and Jerry, like when you were introducing me to circling, when you were circling me, when you were circling with me. Right? You provided a metaphor for that, which, like, out on the frothy edge, on the beach, right? That made it all the way to the center. And what you said is like, do you open or do you close?
Mhm.
Right? Do you open to experience? Like, you're experiencing the thing that you're experiencing. Like, that is what's happening. Right? In my language, you're experiencing exactly what you're experiencing. You can't experience what you're experiencing any more than you're already experiencing it. Like, that's the one perfect thing, is that you are experiencing what you are experiencing. The question is, do you open to it? Do you
Yep.
love it?
Mhm.
Or do you close to it?
Right.
And
Yes.
and the given is that you are either opening or closing. That is not a choice. You are thrown always already into experience.
Yes. Yes.
Do you open to it or close to it? Right? And
That.
yeah. We done?
We're done. That is a beautiful
Next week,
thing.
chapter 3. Love you, buddy.
Right on, brother.
Bye.
Bye.
This brings us to the end of this episode of Chaos, Logos, Order, where we apply the ideas of Jordan Peterson in order to create lives of increasingly heroic meaning. With our hosts, Guy Sengstock of thecirclinginstitute.com and Mark Michael Lewis from the game of heroicmeaning.com. We're going through Jordan Peterson's new book, Beyond Order, chapter by chapter. In this episode, we went through chapter 2, Imagine Who You Could Be, and then aim single-mindedly at that. If you found this helpful and you want more, join us in our next episode as we go through chapter number 3, Do Not Hide Unwanted Things in the Fog. And as always, we leave you with a challenge. Make your deepest happiness your highest priority.